Hi, welcome back to the Glory of God in Math and Science. Today we're continuing to talk about some specific math lessons and how you can seamlessly integrate a biblical worldview without it feeling contrived, awkward, overly spiritualized, or too much analogy. In this episode, we're continuing with a kind of basic level concept that really spans a lot of grade levels. So fractions is something you introduce very early on. I introduced it with my preschoolers all the way up to, continuing in advanced engineering classes in college and such. But we're going to focus today's topic on assuming you're in, late elementary, early middle school, looking at fractions and ratios and proportions, all of which are synonyms, and trying to understand how does that fit in with the real world? How does that help us better understand God and who God is? How would it be different if there hadn't been a God, right? And so all of these things really do come down to the basics in math. So start with basically what a fraction actually is. Find that a lot of times we find these great little workbooks and curriculum that kind of run through the mechanics of what to do with them and don't actually tell us what they are. Many times failures to understand the biblical applications and real life applications is failures to understand what things actually are. So a fraction is where I take a whole of something, whether that be a physical object or a set of things, and I divide it into identically equal parts. Now we can do this with many things, and it is good, especially early on, to show the children that it can be done with many things. So it's very common that we do this with food because as we cook and feed our families, eating is something we all participate in. This is something that happens every day, many times a day. So we could talk about a bag of chips and we could talk about a pie. Both of them are a cohesive whole, but in different ways. So a pie is a whole because it is one pie. If I only have part of it, I don't have a pie, I have a slice or piece of the pie. A bag of chips is a little different in that there are lots of individual chips in the bag. But because the bag serves as a boundary line for the set of chips, it can be considered a whole. All the chips that are in that boundary in the bag is one whole. Now, where the fraction comes in is we then divide those wholes into equal parts. But in order to do that, we first have to make a decision. Now, sometimes God in nature has written laws that make this decision for us. Other times the decision is obvious based on the scenario and situation. Often we make that choice. But we have to decide how many pieces to divide the whole into. So again, just talk about it through examples with your children. When we're looking at a pie, if we intend to have this be a one-time thing, we all eat the pie today and it's gone today, then we count how many people are eating pie, and that's the number of pieces we need to divide the pie into so that it's all eaten in one sitting and gone. Likewise with the bag of chips. We can do this a couple of different ways. That's why I like that actually as an example, is we can count the number of individual chips in the bag. We can calculate the number of chips in the bag using the nutrition label on the back, the serving size, and the number of servings in it. Or we can tie a completely different route that's still a very valid fraction, and that is we could weigh the chips in the bag. And so either of these gives us an accurate accounting of what we have. We know now how many people we want to divide it between. And now we have to do the actual division. So let's talk about the pie. We sometimes divide fractions visually. Because God made us in his image, we're pretty good at deciding and determining if things are equal in size and shape. And so pie is very easily divided into half. Cut it right down the middle, the two sides should match. Pretty easily divided into quarters, cut those into half, likewise into eighths. And so having things we're really good at, we can, by practice and skill, develop the ability to divide things into uneven fractions, thirds and sixths and sevenths and things like that. But it does require consistent skill and practice in order to develop the eye for where to draw the lines so that those pieces are the same size. We can instead use math. So let's say you need 5 pieces out of your pie. That's not an easy thing to divide by just human nature with no practice. But if we know a little bit about math, We can measure the number of inches around the circumference, the outer edge of that pie crust, and we can mathematically divide that into 5 equal parts, and that gives me then my notch lines. And now I can perfectly and evenly divide that without getting into any, advanced geometry, just basic, take a tape measure around it, look at the number, split that into 5 roughly equal parts, mark those lines, bam, you've got it. And so that's a possibility. With a bag of chips, likewise, we hope that it's a number that's easily divisible by whatever it is that we're using. We have a rule in our house to minimize dispute. The leftovers or extras go to mom and dad so the kids don't fight over or fuss over. If we have a little bit more or a little bit leftover pieces, we're not going to try and cut the chip into smaller chips and then divide that evenly amongst all the children. And so you can talk about those, right, real world examples. Likewise, if we were to weigh the bag of chips, now of course you want to zero out a bowl, put the chips in the zeroed out bowl, don't actually weigh the physical bag, though it doesn't usually add much to the weight of the scale anyways. You can again divide that weight into 5 equal parts or whatever your number is, and then weigh that out for each child. And so that's kind of the concept of what a fraction is. We have decided on, or God has created something to be a whole object, and we're splitting it into equal amounts. It might be equal weights, might be equal inches, might be equal numbers by count, might be equal volume, surface area, right? There's so many applications of the fraction. Now we want to take it one step further. Not only do we often use fractions just to split it up and give it to people, but we often require fractions, both God by nature and us as humans in our production of goods that God has given us stewardship over. We have to use fractions in order to make other things. So a lot of recipes, whether we're cooking or baking, are going to have fractions in them. There's a lot of instructions for how to do or make various things. In art, when we're looking at paint and specific colors and color mixing, right, there's very specific ratios that you have to follow in order to get the various shades and hues of the different colors. Likewise, if you're doing something right really advanced, because we want to show the broad scope of this basic principle, even things very complicated like, hey, I'm going to mix together the concrete and I need it to be this particular strength. What's the fineness of the grains and the pebbles that I want in there based on the finished product and how I need that to be. And so we kind of have these base fractions that are part of our ingredients, our recipes, our instructions for how to build or make or do something. Well, oftentimes, we don't always just need a specific amount. So, for example, one of our favorite cookie recipes makes 4 dozen cookies at a time. I'm going to tell you right now, yes, I have a big family, but no, I never make 4 dozen cookies at a time. That's insane. Now, if I was selling them, perhaps. And so I don't want to use that much every time. It's too much. I'll half the recipe. Well, uh-oh. What do I do with all the fractions? This is the neat thing about ratios and proportions and fractions. I can half both numbers, top and bottom. Maybe that works, right? No, it doesn't work. And so we have to understand what the fraction means and how do we do that. So for instance, if I have a recipe that calls for half a cup of flour, it's half of what? Half of 1 cup of flour. Well, I'm already at, right, here's my 1 cup. I'm already at half a cup of flour. I need half of that, so I need this little piece. What would we call that? Sometimes just drawing out the shape and subdividing it helps the students to understand the concept. And then you can give them the math skills to help them more quickly get to that without having to draw it out. So in this case, I need a 1/4 cup. And so it seems kind of counterintuitive, but I kept the top number the same and I doubled the bottom number. That's what happens when we half things in fraction world. And so as we look at, there's an ability to have what's called equivalent fractions. There's multiple ways I can represent the exact same amount of something. And I can maintain the same fractions, the same ratios between ingredients, even if I make a triple batch or a half batch. And likewise, if I'm making, a giant concrete driveway, I can calculate, well, if this is what 1 bag of concrete's directions are, what if I need 40 bags of concrete? And so we can multiply and divide those fractions so that we can scale that up or down. Why is all of this possible? What does this have to do with creation? Well, it's a couple of pieces of things I would encourage you, and you may think of others to throw in there as well. But again, as we've seen in past episodes, We serve a God who runs the universe by mathematical laws. He is a lawgiver. And so should not be surprised when we see that regardless of context, regardless of whether we're counting physical objects and doing fractions, or we're weighing things and doing fractions, or we're calculating time and using fractions, the math is the same. The law is the same. There's this inexplicable universal connection and link that ties together seemingly unrelated things. That should not be if we did not live in a universe controlled by a logical mathematical creating God. If it was this, crazy physical natural process, random chance explosion stuff, then we shouldn't have this common thread of the same rule, the same law governing all things, tying all things together. And it'd be really hard to live in crazy chaos world where nothing is consistent and you can't count on anything. But that's not the kind of God we serve. And so that is the most fundamental basic place to start at. But we also look at that when we divide things into equal parts, we are creating ratios. And when we scale recipes up and down, they only work if we keep those ratios the same. We aren't the first ones to do that. God did it way before we did. When you start to study chemistry, even just a little bit, you see this so clearly. When we combine together atoms to make molecules, to make compounds, to make bonds, and all of these kinds of things, they only combine in certain ratios. If the ratio is off, they won't come together. Now, sometimes by nature or by human choice, we can force them to come together, but the result is a completely different substance than what we were going for. And so God is the first one to kind of use these ratios and scale it up and scale it down, right? At its core, a single molecule of water is 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. There's your ratio, 1 to 2 fraction right there. But what about in a cup of water? How many times has that ratio been scaled to make the whole cup? What about in the ocean? And so you see, God is the one who first created and does and uses these things. And just as we talked in the last episode, this concept of stewardship really comes into play here. Again, we have to be reasonable. Is it necessary for us to know exactly how many hydrogen and oxygen atoms are in the ocean? No. Does God know that number? Absolutely. And he's continually, like last time, adding and subtracting and keeping track of that as evaporation and condensation happen and work together. But there are things and resources, time and money that God has given to us that we are required to either subdivide out fairly and evenly, or that we have to use in ratios with each other so that our product comes out correctly. So for example, let's say you as a parent ask your children, hey, I want you to divide this evenly between you and your siblings. There is a moral aspect to that because, as you know, if you've been a parent at all for any length of time, the temptation is, oh, I get to divide it up and see who gets what. Great, I'm going to cut them small pieces and give myself a big piece. So, right, as parents, we come up with the trick of whoever cuts gets to pick last which slice they get. So then they try a lot harder to be fair, perhaps. But it's something to talk about with your children. Don't just let it happen or have these, kitschy little hacks that parents use like that. Talk to them about biblical stewardship requires that we're just and that we're honest. God actually commands in Scripture. Many times in the Old Testament, he talks about making sure that you're just in your measuring and weighing of products and what you're charging people for them matches what you told them you'd charge them for them. This is, a specific law that shows us God's principle for morality that we need to apply to other situations besides just that. So when you talk to the children about dividing something evenly amongst each other, you need to include the idea that God requires them to be just and honest and fair. And that means that if mom and dad say, hey, divide it up evenly, they need to divide it up evenly and they need to match. And where there's perhaps any error, they need to be the one to eat the error rather than to give themselves the benefit. So there's that piece there, right, of God's justice and morality. The other piece of it is simple stewardship. It is foolish, and the scripture says foolishness is sin, to waste resources. So when we are, making a double batch of cookies for a bake sale that's coming up or an event at church, and we fail to do the math correctly and half the ingredients got doubled and half of them didn't, and what we produce is something that's not salvageable. Now, oftentimes it is, so being resourceful is also wise, but if the result's not salvageable, that was foolish and sinful. I know we don't like to think about that, do we? Foolish and sinful that we made that mistake. Now, it's not like it's unforgivable, so don't go there, but it's more than just, oh, I messed up and now I'm out this money. That's actually a really big problem. And so we need to learn as parents and teach our children as well to slow down and do the math correctly. Take the time, busy mom, to write out on a napkin or a piece of paper what all of the new numbers are, making sure, double checking, right? Check the list twice, that you've doubled everything, you tripled everything, you halved everything, and then move forward so we don't waste resources. Because God has ordained it that the ratio is what works. If we alter the ratio because we didn't do our math correctly, we didn't make an equivalent fraction, we created a totally different fraction, it won't work. And that is because God's law, that little common thread, is running through all of the aspects of creation. And so, again, 100,000 applications that you can give and tasks that you can give to the children, to your students, so that they can really physically see this in the real world. Many of which I already kind of alluded to with the pies and the chips and dividing things evenly. You could do this with money, right? The kids work together on a job and someone agreed to pay them for it, dividing the money evenly. And then sometimes, of course, right? It isn't always the case that fair and right means that everybody gets the exact same amount. So maybe sometimes the agreed upon rate for the job was, okay, the two older ones did most of the work, so they're both going to get a double share, and this person's going to get one part of the share because they helped, but they weren't really, capable of doing as much of the work, and that's okay. Everybody knew it up front and all agreed to it. This is how the workplace works, right? You have your salary or your hourly wage, you signed the contract, you agreed to that price, and not everybody around you is getting that same price, and that's okay. That's not some kind of bizarre unfairness, or it's not the case that everyone ought to earn the same amount of money for every single position in every job. That's not biblical. But you have to make sure that you knew that up front and that that's the amount that you agreed to receive. And so there's many ways fractions can be used besides just literally splitting something into equal parts. It's still fractions. So again, it scales up to very complicated things. Even, super advanced things like, designing airplanes, making sure you've got the densities of the metals exactly right and you've balanced it all well so that you get sufficient lift and you don't end up having an issue. You have weight limits on the planes. All of these things really come down to basic ratios and fractions with some more complicated mathematical understanding and science mixed in, but it's still the same core principle that we have a God who governs the world by mathematical laws, that we can evenly subdivide big things into smaller parts and then use those smaller parts of resources to do things, and that is part of good stewardship of God's creation. And again, that's how you kind of address fractions, ratios, and proportions with a real biblical worldview integrated and not just slapping a Bible verse on or throwing in a kind of seemingly arbitrary analogy. Tune in next time. We'll talk about another one.